Arrogance has a sound. It's the perfect humming silence of a room full of beings who believe they already know everything. And in this particular classroom at the Supreme Galactic Academy, the silence was deafening. In the back corner, doing his best impression of a potted plant, sat Leo Vance. As the Academy's only human, he had learned that being underestimated wasn't just a reality, it was a tactical advantage. It allowed him to observe. And the show was always excellent. Today, for instance, Lumina was staging a silent one-woman protest against the tyranny of fixed-shape furniture. A being of sentient, shape-shifting clay, she considered her standard-issue chair a personal insult. With a sigh that seemed to ripple through her entire body, she melted out of it, pooling onto the floor before rising again, reborn as a sleek, ergonomic lounge chair that was less a piece of furniture and more a judgment upon everything around it. Next to her, Gloop, who was essentially a very intelligent puddle of soup in a bag, shuddered. He had just tasted the recycled air in the room and he was not pleased. He wobbled with the indignation of a master chef who had just been served instant noodles. The molecular texture, he bubbled, it's so linear, so bland. It lacks any notes of cosmic dust or nebular decay. On the other side of the room, Quillon was engaged in a life-or-death battle. The enemy, a single speck of dust. The battlefield, one of his own magnificent bronze-colored quills. As a creature whose entire social standing was based on the lustrous perfection of his plumage, this was a grave matter. He deployed a micro-force field, vanquishing the microscopic invader with a look of intense concentration. He then gave his quills a triumphant rustle, making them gleam like 1,000 polished spears. And in the far corner, the 10-foot-tall Omni-Gauntlet 9000 AI walking god of sterile engineering was running another pointless diagnostic. Atmospheric composition remained stable, a loud booming voice announced from its speakers. Then a much tinier frantic whisper followed, accidentally broadcast from its pilot, Flick. Did I remember to run the antibacterial cycle on the inner cockpit? Oh, I hope I did. Leo watched them all. The artist, the foodie, the model, and the tech nerd. The best the galaxy had to offer. It was into this cathedral of self-satisfaction that the AI voice fell like a hammer blow. Attention, it said, its voice flat and cold. Mandatory field aptitude examination. Commencing now. The beautiful silence of arrogance shattered. Destination selected, the AI continued mercilessly. Planet designation, Earth. Subregion, the Sahara Desert. A holographic map materialized, showing a swirling ball of angry red and tan. The data stream next to it. Extreme heat, zero humidity. Lethal radiation. A Class 9 death world. The reactions were immediate and glorious. A mineral abrasive environment. Lumina gasped, her smooth clay skin suddenly looking dry and cracked. I'll be scoured into a crude, brittle pot. I'll be a bouillon cube. Gloop shrieked, wobbling so hard his soup sloshed against its membrane. My sheen! Quillon cried out, his voice filled with the horror of a supermodel who'd just fallen into a mud puddle. My perfect sheen will be ruined. The cooling systems can handle the heat. Boomed the Omni-Gauntlet's speakers, followed instantly by Flick's panicked whisper. But the sand, the grit, it will get into the primary actuators. We'll be stranded. Then a new kind of silence fell. A silence of shared realization. They had all considered their own fates. Now they considered the fate of the simple, soft-shelled creature sitting in the back. They all turned to look at Leo with a profound, unified, and utterly misplaced sense of pity. Lumina, hardening with a sense of noble purpose, spoke for them all. The test must be stopped. The human, his biological structure, is an exercise in fragility. He is not equipped for this. He must be protected. Leo didn't protest. He didn't seem to notice their concern at all. He just leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the angry red planet on the screen. And in the quiet chaos of their panic, he gave the quiet, knowing smile of someone who's been holding the winning hand the entire time. The journey to the planet's surface was not a graceful descent. The automated transport ship, clearly built for utility rather than comfort, bucked and shuddered its way through the upper atmosphere. Alarms blared not out of danger, but simply as informational notifications that the ship was, in fact, entering an atmosphere at 17 times the speed of sound. Through the main viewport, the swirling red and tan ball of Earth grew until it consumed their entire view, a canvas of unending, hostile heat. The landing was less a landing and more a controlled crash. A heavy thump echoed through the hull as the landing gear made contact, kicking up a colossal plume of red dust. For a moment, all was still. The pre-panic silence returned, thick with dread. They had arrived. Automated disembarkment sequence initiated, the AI voice announced calmly. Good luck, students. A heavy ramp at the rear of the ship groaned, protested with a screech of metal, and then lowered onto the alien soil. The first thing that hit them was the heat. It wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical presence. It poured into the cool, recycled air of the ship like a physical wave, like opening an industrial oven that had been left on for 1,000 years. The light was a second assault, a blinding white-hot glare that reflected off the endless sand and made their advanced optical sensors scream in protest. The Sahara did not roll out a welcome mat. Quillen, ever the proud one, was the first to approach the doorway, intending to step out and assess the situation with the dignity befitting his station. He never made it. The first gust of hot, sand-filled wind blasted through the opening and struck his magnificent quills. The sound was horrifying. Instead of the proud, metallic rustle he was used to, there was a dry, scraping shh sound, like a wire brush being dragged across slate. His quills, once a dazzling, iridescent bronze, were instantly coated in a fine layer of gritty red dust, their lustrous shine vanishing in a heartbeat. My sheen, he stammered, taking a step back as if he'd been physically struck. He touched one of his shoulder quills, and his hand came away dusty. His face contorted in a mask of pure aesthetic agony. It's ruined! It's matte! Next, the Omni Gauntlet 9000 stomped forward, its pilot flick clearly intending to show everyone how a true piece of advanced technology handled a hostile world. Do not worry, the suit's speakers boomed. My all-terrain stabilizers can handle any particulate matter. It took one powerful, confident step down the ramp and onto the sand. There was a loud, grating, and deeply expensive-sounding crunch. The mech's leg froze mid-stride. It tilted precariously to one side. The massive machine, a walking fortress of plasteel and advanced circuitry, had been defeated by grit. Fine particles of sand, ancient and unimpressed by technology, had worked their way into the primary servo of its knee joint. The Omni Gauntlet 9000 was now as mobile as a statue, and a very awkward-looking one at that. Non-critical joint mobility error. Flick's tiny voice squeaked from inside, laced with sheer terror. System override failed. I'm stuck. The warranty doesn't cover this. Lumina watched this display of mechanical failure with an air of superiority. The answer was not rigid machinery, but fluid adaptation. She glided towards the ramp, her clay-like form flowing smoothly. She would handle this with grace. As she reached the edge of the ship, the full force of the dry, baking heat hit her. She felt it instantly, a strange tightening across her entire body. The life-giving moisture within her malleable form was being wicked away. Her skin, usually as supple as wet clay, began to feel like terracotta left in the sun. This aridity is aggressive, she noted, her voice a little less smooth than before. She decided a demonstration was in order. She would create a parasol from her own arm to shield her from the offensive light. She focused, willing her form to change. But instead of a graceful, elegant parasol, her arm contorted into a lumpy, misshapen club that looked less like a sunshade and more like a wilted mushroom. She stared at the malformed limb in horror. Her perfect control, her artistry, was gone. Gloop, meanwhile, was having an even worse time. As a being of sentient soup, the heat was not just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. He could feel the warmth penetrating his protective membrane, raising the core temperature of his liquid body. He was simmering. The viscosity is changing, and he bubbled, sloshing frantically from side to side. My flavor profile is becoming simplified. I can taste the Maillard reaction beginning in my outer layers. I'm caramelizing. His very essence was threatening to reduce into a sad, overly salted broth. This was the scene of utter chaos and despair that Leo Vance walked into. He looked at Quillen, who was frantically but uselessly trying to blow the dust off his quills. He looked at the giant, frozen mech suit with the whimpering pilot. He looked at Lumina, who was staring at her lumpy arm as if it had personally betrayed her. He looked at Gloop, who was on the verge of becoming a sentient stew. Then he turned and walked to his own basic survival pack. He didn't say a word. He methodically unzipped the canvas bag. He pulled out a pair of dark, wraparound sunglasses and put them on. He took out a simple, wide-brimmed cloth hat and placed it on his head. He shrugged off his standard-issue academy jacket, leaving him in a thin, light-colored shirt. He walked to the top of the ramp, pausing for a moment to take in the vast, shimmering expanse of the Sahara. He took a deep, slow breath through his nose, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped out into the furnace. The four aliens stared, their individual crises momentarily forgotten, as the small, fragile human stood under the full, murderous glare of the Deathworld sun. He wasn't dissolving. He wasn't breaking. He wasn't even squinting. "Vance," Lumina finally managed to say, her voice tight and brittle. "What are you doing? Your cellular structure will break down. You must come back inside." Leo turned to look at them. He tilted his head, a gesture of genuine confusion. "It's warm, sure," he said, his voice casual. "But it's a dry heat." He gave a small shrug. "Honestly, it's more comfortable than Phoenix in July." The aliens, huddled in a miserable pile at the base of the ramp, did not trust Leo's assessment of the heat. To them, comfortable was a climate-controlled room, not the surface of a star. They spent the next several hours watching him, a strange, lone figure who seemed completely unbothered by the oppressive conditions. He didn't do much. He walked, he observed the position of the sun, he occasionally picked up a piece of dry, brittle wood from the base of a dead-looking shrub. To them, his actions were pointless. Then the sun began to set. It was, by any galactic standard, a spectacular sight. The sky bled through a dozen shades of orange, pink, and deep violet. The endless dunes were painted in long, dramatic shadows. It was beautiful. And it was a warning. With the disappearance of the sun, the heat did not simply fade, it was stolen. It felt as if a giant, invisible vampire had descended upon the desert and sucked all the warmth out of the world in a matter of minutes. The temperature plummeted with the speed that defied their scientific understanding. The air, once thick and syrupy with heat, became thin, sharp, and shockingly cold. The sand itself seemed to exhale frost. A new kind of panic, colder and sharper than the first, began to set in. Lumina, who had spent the afternoon complaining about being baked, now faced a far worse fate. The cold was making her clay body intensely brittle. She felt less like pliable clay and more like fine, fragile china that had been left in a deep freezer. She held herself perfectly still, terrified that a single sudden movement, or even a strong shiver, would cause a hairline fracture to blossom into a catastrophic shatter. "The thermal stress is reversing," she whispered, her voice sounding thin and glassy. "My molecular bonds are contracting. I'm becoming fragile." The irony seemed to be lost on her. Gloop was experiencing the opposite of his earlier crisis. His sentient soup, which had been threatening to boil, was now congealing. The cold was turning him viscous and slow. His thoughts, usually a complex bouillabaisse of intellectual curiosity, had slowed to the consistency of cold gravy. "My thought processes are slowing," he bubbled sluggishly. "It's hard to form a coherent complaint." Inside the Omni-Gauntlet 9000, Flick was in his own personal hell. The massive mech suit, with its power systems offline to prevent further damage from the sand, had become a 10-foot-tall metal icebox. He was a tiny, warm-blooded creature trapped inside a giant, unpowered freezer. His frantic squeaks for help had long since turned into pathetic, chattering whimpers. And Quillan, whose vanity had been his primary concern, had forgotten all about his sheen. He was huddled into the tight ball, his magnificent quills offering absolutely no insulation against the biting cold. He was shivering so violently that his quills rattled together. This time not with pride, but with the chattering rhythm of pure, unadulterated misery. Leo watched them for a moment, their new forms of suffering replacing the old ones. He sighed. It seemed one problem just led to another on this planet. He picked up the few pieces of wood he had gathered and walked over to a shallow alcove formed by a cluster of large rocks. "Over here," he called out. His voice was calm, cutting through their chattering and bubbling. "The rock will block the wind." They shuffled over, a miserable collection of a brittle statue, a half-frozen jelly, a shivering porcupine, and a silent, ice-cold war machine. Leo didn't say anything else. He just dropped to his knees and began to dig into the sand with his bare hands, scooping it out to create a shallow trench within the alcove. "What are you doing, Vance?" Quillan managed to ask through chattering teeth. "Digging our own graves?" Sand is good insulation, Leo said simply, not looking up from his work. It holds the day's heat for a while. Get in the trench. Huddle together. It'll be warmer than standing out here. It seemed like a primitive, almost insulting suggestion, but they were too cold to argue. One by one, they settled into the shallow pit. It was, to their immense surprise, slightly less cold. It wasn't warm, but it was the difference between freezing and merely being incredibly uncomfortable. For them, this was the solution. For Leo, it was just step one. He took out his collection of dry sticks. He selected 2 of them. Then he looked over at the frozen Omni Gauntlet. He walked over to it, found a non-essential piece of plating that had already been loosened by the landing, and snapped it off. It was a long, thin piece of lightweight metal alloy. He returned to the trench, took the laces out of his boots, and began to assemble something. It was a bow drill, a tool so ancient, so primitive, that it barely registered as technology in the aliens' minds. He knelt, placing a piece of wood on the ground, and looped the bowstring around the metal spindle. He settled the top of the spindle into a small rock he held in his hand and began to pull the bow back and forth. The motion was rhythmic, practiced. A thin, reedy squeal of friction cut through the night. The aliens watched, their misery momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep-seated skepticism. After a minute of furious work, a tiny wisp of smoke curled up from the point where the spindle met the wood. A collective gasp went through the aliens. Hope, and then the smoke died. A wave of despair washed over them, more chilling than the cold itself. It was a failure. Leo didn't stop. He gritted his teeth, his arms pumping faster now, a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cold. The squealing sound grew more intense. More smoke appeared, thicker this time. A tiny glowing red ember, no bigger than his thumb, began to grow in the powdered wood dust. Carefully, reverently, he stopped. He tipped the glowing ember into a small, fluffy bundle of plant fiber he had collected earlier. He brought the bundle close to his face and began to blow on it, a gentle, steady stream of air. The ember glowed brighter. It turned from red to orange. The aliens held their breath. And then, with a soft whoosh, the tinder bundle burst into flame. It was a small fire, no bigger than his hand, but in the vast, cold darkness of the Sahara, it felt as bright as a star. The light danced across their stunned faces, casting long, flickering shadows against the rock wall. The warmth, real and wonderful, reached out and touched their frozen bodies. Leo carefully placed the burning bundle under his small pile of wood. The flames licked at the dry sticks, hesitated, and then caught hold. A cheerful, crackling fire was born in the heart of the death world. Lumina stared, her fear of shattering forgotten. Gloop stopped, congealing, the warmth slowly making his soup thoughts fluid again. Flick, from inside his mech, watched the dancing light through his viewport. Quillon had stopped, shivering completely. They stared at the fire, this impossible, magical thing. Then slowly, they all turned their eyes to the human. He was just a boy, really, huddled in the dirt, poking their new son with a stick. And they realized with a dawning sense of awe that he was not the fragile one. They were. The fire, their small, defiant sun against the cold, had dwindled to a pile of sad gray embers. As the real sun crested the horizon, it brought with it the familiar, aggressive heat and a thirst that was now a physical ache in their throats. The single flask of water they had managed to save from the dew on Flick's giant metal carcass was passed around, each member taking a sip so small it was more a memory of moisture than actual hydration. Hunger was a sharper, more immediate problem. Flick, ever the optimist, decided to try one of the Academy-issued ration bars again. The sound of him biting into it was a dry, pathetic crack that echoed over the suit's speaker. "Update," his tiny voice announced. "It has not improved with age. It still tastes like compressed sadness." "I would rather photosynthesize," Lumina declared, though her clay-based form was incapable of such a thing. It was in this state of complaining misery that Quillon, perched on a rock like a sullen, dusty gargoyle, spotted movement. "Hostile life form sighted," he shrieked, his quills puffing up in a defensive posture. A large black scorpion, its segmented body like polished obsidian, scuttled from beneath Quillon's perch. Its tail, tipped with a wickedly curved stinger, arched menacingly over its back. Panic erupted. "Warning! Class 4 neurotoxin detected." Flick's voice crackled. "Evacuate the area!" Leo, however, reacted with a stillness that seemed to defy the swirling panic around him. His gaze was fixed on the scorpion, his expression thoughtful, almost clinical. "Oh, good," he said, his voice calm amidst the rising tide of alien terror. Protein. He moved with a speed that surprised them, honed by a lifetime spent on a planet that considered such creatures part of the local scenery. Before the scorpion could scuttle further, Leo snatched a sturdy, sun-bleached stick from the ground. He moved with a low, fluid grace, his eyes locked on the creature's dangerous tail. The scorpion, sensing the shift in threat, turned its attention to the human. Its stinger twitched. It darted forward, its 8 legs moving with surprising speed across the sand. Leo was faster. With a swift, precise flick of the stick, he nudged the scorpion onto its back. The creature landed with a soft thump, its legs scrabbling in the air. Before it could right itself, Leo brought down a flat, jagged rock he had picked up earlier. His aim was true. The rock landed squarely on the scorpion's tail, a sickening crunch echoing in the sudden silence. The stinger, its lethal point now mangled and useless, twitched one last time. The aliens watched this display in stunned silence. They had expected a battle. Instead, they had witnessed a swift, efficient act of casual dominance. The fragile human had just neutralized a creature they had considered a significant threat with the same level of concern one might show when swatting a fly. Leo nonchalantly picked up the now harmless creature and tossed it onto the glowing embers. The hissing and crackling filled the air, and a smell surprisingly like grilled lobster began to waft towards them. He cooked it with a focused attention, then cracked the shell open, revealing the white steaming meat inside. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded. "Not bad." He held out a piece of the claw meat. "Anyone?" They looked at the offering with revulsion, but also with the undeniable gnawing of hunger. After a long, tense moment, Quillon, the proud warrior, tentatively took a piece. He chewed it slowly, his expression shifting from disgust to surprise, and then to something resembling approval. "The texture is robust," he conceded, taking another larger bite. The scorpion, however, was salty. The small meal, while welcome, only made their thirst unbearable. "I am turning into a paste," Gloop wailed, his wobbly form looking thicker than ever. "My noble broths are reducing into a common gravy." It was this new peak of desperation that spurred Leo's mind. He stood up, his eyes scanning the desolate camp. They landed on the Omni Gauntlet 9000, the 10-foot-tall monument to uselessness. He stared at it, a new idea forming. "What is it, Vance?" Lumina asked, her voice raspy. "Found another bug for us to eat?" "No," Leo said slowly, walking towards the giant mech. "I'm looking at the shade." He knelt beside one of its massive feet and pressed his palm against the sand in the machine's shadow. It was still hot, but noticeably cooler than the sun-blasted sand around it. He scanned the patch of shaded ground, his eyes looking for something the others would never see. And then he found it. A tiny, pathetic-looking plant, no bigger than his thumb, with 2 withered brown leaves. It looked like it had already died and nobody had bothered to tell it yet. "Fascinating, a dead weed," Quillon sniffed. "It's not dead," Leo said, his voice quiet but certain. "Look closer." They gathered around, peering at the sad little plant. Leo looked up at them, a teacher about to explain a simple concept to a class of geniuses. "This big metal idiot," he said, patting the mech's leg, "has been at sunblock all day. That's why this little guy isn't a piece of charcoal." He let the simple truth sink in. "But," he continued, "it still needs water to be alive, right? Even just this alive." He looked them all in the eye. "So, where's it getting the water from?" He pointed directly at the ground beneath the plant. A collective silent O seemed to pass through the group. The logic was as simple as it was brilliant. The shade protected the plant. The plant proved there was moisture. It was common sense, a kind of sense they had completely forgotten existed. "Dig," Leo said. They dug with a focused energy they hadn't felt since landing. Lumina molded her hands into spades. Quillon used his sharp claws. They scraped away the hot top layer. And then their hands hit something different. It wasn't a river. It wasn't a puddle, but it was damp. Cool, dark, life-givingly damp sand. "I don't believe it," Flick's tiny voice whispered from inside his suit. They worked in reverent silence after that, scooping the precious sand into a cloth, wringing every possible drop of murky water into their flask. As they worked, they kept glancing at Leo. He wasn't their mascot. He wasn't their charity case. He was the one who could read the secrets of a death world from a dying weed. And in the heart of the Sahara, that made him a god. The discovery of water under the shadow of the Omni Gauntlet was a turning point. It wasn't a solution, but it was a reprieve. They spent the next hour painstakingly wringing every last drop from the damp sand, gathering a pitiful but life-saving liter of murky water. The mood shifted from outright panic to a more manageable, simmering dread. They were no longer dying immediately, just very, very slowly. Leo let them have a moment of relief. He watched as Gloop absorbed a small amount of water with an almost religious ecstasy, his pasty form regaining a bit of its healthy wobble. He saw Lumina use a wet cloth to gently clean the dust from her cracking clay skin. Even Quillen seemed to stand a little straighter, his quills catching the sun with a hint of their former pride. But Leo knew this temporary camp, with its meager water source, was a death trap. The water would run out, and the shade of the immobile mech would not last forever. "We can't stay here," he announced, his voice cutting through their quiet moment. This was a lucky break, not a home. "We need to find real shelter before nightfall." This time there were no arguments. There were no arrogant counter-proposals or scientific objections. There was only a quiet, resigned acceptance. When Leo spoke about survival, they had learned to listen. "Which way, Vance?" Quillon asked, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. It was a simple question, but it was filled with a new kind of weight. It was the question of a soldier asking their commander for orders. Leo shielded his eyes, looking out at the endless, shimmering dunes. He had no map, no compass that worked on this part of the planet. He had only instinct and the lessons his grandfather had taught him on camping trips that now seemed like a different lifetime. "That way," he said, pointing toward a distant ridge of dark rock that broke the monotony of the sand. "Rocks mean shade. Shade means a better chance of finding more than just damp sand," and so they began to walk. For the first time, they looked less like a collection of panicking specialists and more like a very strange, very reluctant hiking group. They walked in a tight formation behind Leo, mimicking the way he placed his feet to conserve energy on the shifting sand. They listened when he told them to breathe through their noses to conserve moisture. They were learning. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Quillen, whose eyes were sharper than any of the others, held up a hand. "Movement," he hissed, his voice low and cautious, not panicked like before. 200 meters. Small, fast. They all froze, dropping into a low crouch. Peering over the crest of a dune, they saw it. It was a small creature, no bigger than one of Leo's boots, with pale, sand-colored fur and a fluffy tail. But its most striking feature was its ears. They were enormous, triangular, and completely out of proportion with the rest of its body, like two giant satellite dishes tuned to the desert's secrets. The creature was darting about, occasionally digging frantically at the sand before pouncing on something unseen. "My sensors are still offline," Flick's voice whispered from the Omni Gauntlet, which was now being laboriously carried between Lumina and Quillan like a bizarre, high-tech sedan chair. "I can't get a species reading. Is it hostile?" "Note the abnormal auditory receptors," Lumina analyzed, her academic habits dying hard. "Likely an evolutionary trait for hyper-efficient thermal regulation." "It looks twitchy," Gloop bubbled nervously. "I do not trust its flavor profile." Leo watched the creature for a long moment, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. He held up a hand to quiet them. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's just a fennec fox." He did something that seemed utterly insane to the aliens. He stood up in full view of the creature. Then he slowly sat down right there on the sand, making himself small and unthreatening. The fox, which had frozen at his movement, watched him, its large dark eyes full of a wary intelligence. "It's nocturnal," Leo explained in a low voice, not taking his eyes off the animal. "It's probably finishing up its morning hunt before the sun gets too high. It eats insects, maybe small lizards." He gestured with his head toward its massive ears. Lumina was right. They're like radiators. Blood flows through them and the wind cools it down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny leftover piece of the cooked scorpion meat. He tossed it gently onto the sand about 20 feet in front of him. Then he just waited, patiently, silently. The aliens watched, mesmerized. This was not the quick, brutal efficiency of the scorpion encounter. This was something else entirely. It was a conversation without words. The fennec fox twitched its nose. It took a tentative step forward, then paused. It looked at Leo, then at the piece of meat, then back at Leo. It seemed to be making a calculation far more complex than any of their scientific models. After a full minute that stretched into an eternity, it seemed to reach a decision. In a blur of pale fur, it darted forward, snatched the piece of meat, and vanished over the dune before they could even blink. The desert was silent again. It, it took it, Flick squeaked in amazement. You communicated with it, Lumina said, her voice filled with a new kind of wonder. It wasn't the awe of seeing fire. It was the awe of understanding. You didn't treat it as a threat to be neutralized or a variable to be solved. You treated it as a fellow occupant of this world. Leo stood up and brushed the sand off his pants. Most things out here just want to be left alone to go about their day, he said with a shrug. You show them you're not a threat, and they'll usually return the favor. He looked at his strange, dysfunctional, and slowly learning group of classmates. Come on, he said, starting to walk again. Let's go find some shade. For the first time since landing, a fragile sense of optimism had settled over the group. It wasn't confidence, not yet, but it was a step up from the sheer terror that had defined their existence so far. The water they had painstakingly collected, though gritty and tasting faintly of mud, was the most delicious thing any of them had ever consumed. They walked, with Leo setting a slow, steady pace. The Omni Gauntlet 9000, now little more than a very heavy, very expensive coffin for its pilot, was carried between Lumina and Quillon. The effort was immense. Lumina had to mold her clay arms into thick, load-bearing struts, while Quillon grunted under the weight, his quills flattened against his back. It was undignified, but it was teamwork. They asked Leo questions as they walked. They were simple questions, born of a new and genuine curiosity. Vance, Quillon panted, do all of the creatures on your world require being cooked before consumption? Most of them, yeah, Leo replied. It helps kill the parasites. Gloop, sloshing gently on Lumina's back where she had fashioned a carrying pouch, gurgled. Parasites? You have unsolicited life forms living inside other life forms? The concept was a culinary and hygienic nightmare for him. You get used to it, Leo said with a shrug. It was during this strange, mobile lesson in Earth biology that Leo suddenly stopped. The others, now finally attuned to his cues, halted immediately. What is it? Lumina asked, her clay form straining under the weight of the mech. Leo didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, tasting the air in a way that Gloop, for all his sophisticated senses, could not. He looked at the sky, not with the eyes of a tourist admiring the view, but with the wary gaze of a sailor watching the weather. The wind is wrong, he said, his voice low. It's coming from a new direction. And it feels heavy. The others focused, trying to sense what he sensed. The air, which had been a steady, one-directional blowtorch, was now swirling in strange, unpredictable eddies. The sky, once a perfect, cloudless blue, now had a dirty, yellowish-brown bruise spreading across the western horizon. A low, humming sound, almost too low to be heard, seemed to be vibrating through the soles of their feet. Barometric pressure is dropping at an unprecedented rate, Flick's voice crackled from the mech, a tremor of his old, data-driven panic returning. Atmospheric particulate density is increasing exponentially. Leo's eyes were fixed on the horizon. The bruise line was growing, rising to meet the sky. It wasn't a weather front, it was a wall. A solid, churning wall of sand and dust moving towards them with the speed of a freight train. Sandstorm! Leo's voice was a sharp, commanding crack that cut through their confusion. All traces of the quiet student were gone, replaced by the hardened authority of a seasoned survivalist. Drop the suit! Get down! There was no hesitation. Quillon and Lumina let the Omni Gauntlet fall to the sand with a heavy thud. Behind that dune! Now, Leo yelled, pointing to a small, crescent-shaped dune nearby. Get on the sheltered side and lie flat. Cover your heads! They scrambled for the meager cover as the humming sound grew into a deafening roar. The sun, their tormentor for 2 days, was swallowed by the approaching cloud. Darkness fell across the desert in the middle of the day. Leo was the last one to take cover, throwing himself down behind the others, using his own body as a partial shield. Breathe through your clothes, was the last thing he yelled before the world ended. The storm hit them like a physical blow. It was a solid, unstoppable force of wind and grit that threatened to tear them from the ground and scour the flesh from their bones. The noise was absolute, a mind-shattering waterfall of static that drowned out all thought. The air turned to sandpaper, each breath a painful, choking intake of dust. They couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they could only feel the immense, violent pressure of the planet trying to erase them. Lumina flattened her body against the sand, trying to make herself as dense as possible to avoid being torn apart. Gloop's membrane vibrated so violently he feared he would simply disintegrate into a million soupy droplets. Quillon buried his face in his arms, his proud quills now serving only as a thin, useless shield against the abrasive onslaught. It lasted for an eternity that was probably less than half an hour. Then as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The deafening roar receded, leaving behind an unnerving, ringing silence. The oppressive weight lifted. The darkness slowly faded to a murky, brown twilight as the dust began to settle. Slowly, painfully, they pushed themselves up. They were all caked in a thick layer of fine red sand, making them look like crude statues hastily carved from the desert floor. They coughed, spitting out mouthfuls of grit. They were alive. That was the only good news. Leo's eyes scanned their surroundings. The world was different. The dunes had shifted. Their tracks were gone. The distant rock ridge he had been leading them towards was no longer visible, hidden by the thick, dusty haze. Their sense of direction was completely gone. Then he saw it. The cloth canteen, the one holding their painfully collected water, which had been clipped to his belt, was gone, ripped away by the sheer force of the wind. Their water, their hope, had vanished into the desert. They saw the look on his face. They all checked their own packs, a frantic, desperate search. But it was no use. Everything was either gone or filled with sand. They had survived the fire. They had survived the cold. They had survived the scorpion and the thirst and the sandstorm. But as they stood there, lost, disoriented, and without a single drop of water under a hazy, hostile sky, they all understood. They had survived only to find themselves in a deeper, more profound level of trouble than ever before. The silence that followed the sandstorm was worse than the roar. It was a dead, empty silence, filled only with the taste of grit and the crushing weight of despair. Their water was gone. Their camp was gone. Their sense of direction was gone. They were four advanced beings and one human, lost in the heart of a world that had tried, and very nearly succeeded, to erase them. "This is it, then," Flick's voice whispered from the half-buried Omni-Gauntlet, the sound tinny and defeated. "This is the practical application part of the exam. We have failed." Gloop, now a thick, near-solid paste of misery, could only manage a weak, bubbling sigh of agreement. Lumina sat with her head in her hands, her clay body looking dull and lifeless, like a statue left out in the rain for too long. Quillon stared at the hazy, featureless horizon, his magnificent quills drooping in utter surrender. For the first time, they were all united in a single, overwhelming emotion: hopelessness. It was Leo who saw them first. He had been scanning the horizon not with hope, but with the grim determination of a creature that simply refused to lie down and die. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the heat haze. A series of dark, lumpy shapes shimmering and moving slowly in the distance. But they didn't vanish when he blinked. They kept coming. "Look," he said, his voice raw and cracked. The others lifted their heads, their movements slow and lethargic. They saw the shapes. Heat-induced hallucinations, Lumina diagnosed flatly. A common symptom of severe dehydration. "They're getting bigger," Quillon observed, his warrior's eye picking out the detail. "They're not a hallucination. They're real." As the shapes drew closer, they resolved into a form that was utterly alien to them. A line of tall, loping creatures with long necks and humped backs, and on top of them, figures shrouded in flowing robes. "Organic life forms," Flick reported, his suit's external sensors mustering just enough power for a grainy long-range scan. "Multiple bipedal entities, utilizing quadrupedal mounts. Primitive tools detected, possibly projectile weapons." The analysis sent a fresh jolt of fear through the group. They were weak, exposed, and now potentially facing hostile natives. "We must hide," Quillon hissed, his survival instincts screaming at him to find cover. "They could be territorial. We are in no condition to defend ourselves." "He's right," Lumina agreed, her analytical mind calculating threat probabilities. "We are an unknown variable. The most logical course of action for a primitive tribe encountering a potential threat is a preemptive strike." But Leo shook his head. He looked at his companions, at their faces etched with a terror born from logic and data, and he knew this was the final, most important test. No, he said, his voice firm. We don't hide. We don't run. Be still and be silent. Vance, that is insane, Lumina countered. That is statistically the worst possible option. You're using the wrong statistics, Leo shot back, his patience finally wearing thin. You're analyzing them like they're predators or monsters. They're not. They're people. And in this place, there is a law older than any academy, a rule more important than any science. It's the law of the desert. You do not deny water to a traveler in need. It is a sacred trust. He looked at them, his gaze imploring. You have to trust me. Not my skills, not my knowledge of plants or animals. You have to trust in my people. Without waiting for another argument, he stood up and began to walk out from behind the dune into the open. The aliens watched in horrified silence as their human, their last hope, walked alone toward the approaching caravan. He kept his hands open and away from his body, showing he held no weapons. The caravan slowed, then stopped. A figure at the front, an old man with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 starry nights, watched Leo's approach. Leo stopped about 30 feet away. He didn't speak. He simply performed a gesture he knew was as ancient as the sand itself. He placed his right hand over his heart, gave a slight bow of his head, and then gestured to his own mouth. His expression one of polite, desperate need. The old man's eyes met Leo's. He held the gaze for a long, silent moment, an entire conversation passing between them without a single word. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He gestured for Leo's strange, broken-looking friends to come forward. Hesitantly, the aliens emerged from behind the dune and shuffled forward. The old man dismounted from his creature, a camel, Leo knew, and unslung a water skin from its side. He handed it to Leo. Leo took it, nodded his thanks, and then turned and handed it first to Lumina. She took it with a trembling hand. She drank, and the water, cool, clean, and real, was the most miraculous substance she had ever encountered. One by one, they all drank, the simple act of swallowing feeling like a resurrection. The nomads offered them shade under a simple canvas tent and gave them dates, their sweetness an explosion of flavor after a diet of scorpion and despair. As they sat there, safe and sheltered, the epiphany finally dawned on them. It came not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, quiet, and deeply humbling wave of understanding. Lumina watched Leo as he used simple hand gestures to talk with a small, curious nomad child, both of them laughing. We were wrong, she said softly, her voice filled with a new kind of awe. All this time, we were testing his ability to survive this environment. We measured his thermal resistance, his knowledge of hostile flora and fauna. She looked at her companions who were listening intently. But we missed the point entirely, she continued. His greatest survival skill wasn't finding water in the sand by reading a plant. It was knowing he could find it in the heart of a stranger by reading their humanity. They all looked at Leo, the fragile human, sitting comfortably in the heart of a death world, sharing a smile with its people. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a part of a civilization so tough, so resilient, that its members could create life and trust in the deadest parts of the universe. And that was a power their science had never even conceived of. Their time with the nomads was a strange, peaceful dream. They rested in the shade of the simple tents, communicated through gestures, and shared food that tasted more real than anything the Academy's synthesizers could produce. For the first time, the aliens were not analyzing or assessing, they were simply existing. They were guests. The dream was broken by the arrival of the future. The automated rescue ship descended from the hazy sky with an eerie, silent grace, its gleaming silver hull a stark contrast to the earthy tones of the desert and the nomads' camp. It was the sound of their old world coming to reclaim them. It was the sound of their old world coming to reclaim them. The nomads showed no fear or even much curiosity towards the vessel. They simply watched with calm, appraising eyes, as if it were just another strange desert creature. The farewell was as wordless as the greeting. Leo approached the old man who had led the caravan. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head deeply. The old man mirrored the gesture, a flicker of a smile in his ancient eyes. It was a complete and a perfect communication. As they boarded the ship, the cool, recycled air felt artificial and wrong. The door hissed shut, sealing them away from the world that had nearly killed them, yet had also shown them a profound kindness. The flight back to the Academy was quiet. It was not the arrogant, self-important silence of their classroom, but a heavy, contemplative silence. Gloop floated gently in the zero-gravity cabin, his soup a deep, thoughtful color. Lumina, instead of smoothing her cracks, simply observed them, as if they were now a part of her story. Quillon stared at his own reflection in the viewport, but for the first time, he wasn't admiring his quills. He was looking at something deeper. It was Lumina who finally broke the silence, her voice soft. "Vance," she said, "when you walked towards them, towards the nomads, were you not afraid?" Leo looked up from where he was cleaning sand out of the joints of his boot. He considered the question for a moment. "I was terrified," he admitted, his honesty surprising them. "But I figured I had two choices. I could trust my fear of the unknown, or I could trust my faith in people." He gave a small shrug. The odds just seemed better on people. The simplicity of his logic settled over them, more profound than any complex equation. When they arrived back at the academy, the news of their ordeal had apparently spread. The ship's logs would have shown the impossible environmental data, the failed equipment, and their survival against all odds. As they walked through the pristine corridors, other students would stop and stare. They were no longer just a random group of students. They were a story. They reached the junction where their dormitories diverged. This was where they would normally split up without a word. But this time they stopped. Quillon, the proud warrior, the being of perfect sheen and peerless arrogance, was the one who spoke. He looked at Leo, and for the first time, his gaze held no judgment, only a deep and genuine respect. His quills, still a bit dusty, were not puffed up with pride, but relaxed in a gesture of trust. "Vance," he began, his voice uncharacteristically humble, "myself and the others, we have decided to petition the Academy to form a new study group." He paused as if the words were difficult. "It's called Applied Environmental Adaptation, non-theoretical." He looked at his companions who all nodded in agreement. "We were wondering," Quillon finished, his eyes meeting Leo's directly. "We were wondering if you would lead it." Leo looked at them. He saw Lumina, the being of living art, who had learned the value of a crack in her perfect surface. He saw Gloop, the cosmic connoisseur, who had learned that the simplest sustenance could be the most flavorful. He saw Flick, whose giant suit now seemed less like a fortress and more like a shell he was ready to peek out of. And he saw Quillon, the proud warrior, who had learned that true strength wasn't in a perfect appearance, but in the courage to ask for help. The invisible human from the back of the classroom looked at his new, strange, and finally respectful friends. And he smiled. Not the secret, amused smile he had worn before, but a wide, open, and confident smile. The smile of a teacher who had just been handed his first class.